This
Okay, I guess that's my cue. Um, Hi everyone. I am Melissa McCurry. I am a trauma therapist and former campus victims advocate. I've worked in a couple of other community agencies as well. Um, all those fancy letters behind my name. I know different states have different meanings for their abbreviations. So mine are Masters of Arts from Wake Forest University. Um, I actually live in Raleigh, North Carolina. And so I'm licensed with the North Carolina Board as a licensed clinical mental health counselor, a licensed clinical addiction specialist, associate level, and a certified clinical trauma professional. My clinical specialization, and to be honest, complete obsession with all things trauma, developed from seeing the really good job we were doing with immediate response, like crisis response and advocacy. Um, but then when I went into private practice, I was having women call me in their 30s, 40s, 50s, even 60s, um, saying, I have never dealt with this thing that happened to me when I was in college or when I was in high school or, at some time, earlier in my life. Especially the little bit older generations, they were the graduate in May, get married in June crowd, right? So they got married, they had kids, they weren't thinking about it, they were just sort of stuffing it back there way in the back and trying to forget about it. The problem is we can't do that. Our brain doesn't let us do that. It holds on to it because we store trauma in our body. And so it was continuing to come out, and for unfortunately for a lot of people, um, they had they had stacked trauma upon trauma upon trauma because their hypervigilance was increased, they were irritable, that some of the things we're going to go through, trying not to get ahead of myself. Um, but um the point being, just, I was seeing that there were so many more traumas that did not have to have happened if they had gotten trauma intervention. And I don't want to put out that, as much as I love trauma therapy and, think it's all that and then some, I do not want to put out that it's the magic pill and we're going to make you forget about what happened. But the goal is to get to a place where you can remember it without reliving it. Um, and, of course, preventing those additional traumas. Um, the biggest thing I really want to point out right now, right up front, th this session is in no way meant to be prevention versus therapy, but what I want it to be is how we can bridge that gap, how we can connect those together and try to engage the 18 to 25-year-old population in trauma therapy kind of right after or soon after uh, the event, ideally. Um, let's see. Okay. Uh, Sorry, it's not wanting to change slides for me. What is happening? Okay, we're gonna do it this way. Okay, sorry. Creating an inclusive and emotionally safe environment is essential in anything trauma-informed learning, therapy, what have you. So always prioritizing safety, choice, and agency at all times. Please don't ever feel pressured to disclose or engage beyond your comfort level. I will use the term survivor inclusively, respecting all identities, backgrounds. Unless otherwise stated, there are two case study stories that I have included that are, that those I will specify. Um, but other than that, Survivor is meant to be inclusive of everyone. Um, I see most everybody has their camera off, which is fine. I know how it is in the age of virtual trainings. It's easier to just turn your camera off and listen, but I always love it when I can see faces and see that stuff is landing or see that somebody's like looking at me like I've three heads and have no idea what I'm talking about because I've gone into therapist speak, which I will try very hard not to do. But if I do, feel free to put in the chat, raise your hand, something if I use an abbreviation or something you're not sure what I'm talking about. Um, Questions. We have two wonderful volunteers monitoring or moderating the chat for me. Um, so I'm going to try to stick to a 70-ish. As you get to know me, you will know that I'm a chatter, I'm a Southerner, storyteller, so it takes 10 minutes to tell you how to go 2 miles down the road. So that's why I say 70-ish to leave time at the end for questions and discussion. Um, Main goals for today, understanding developmental vulnerability of this particular age group, lifespan development wise, apply trauma-informed engagement tools, clarify therapy's role, integrate prevention with response, and strengthen referrals. So I found this image and it just perfectly sums up what this age is. 18 to 25 is the last major chunk of neurological development for humans. It is where it's still under construction. It's where we get emotional regulation, impulse control, judgment, identity formation, relational templates are all actively consolidating during this window. And if anybody else has children in this window, you will understand what I mean when I say I have two of them in this age range, and a lot of times I find myself having to remember it's not their fault that they're driving me crazy. Their brain is not done yet. It's not their fault. They are. But you'll find a lot of black and white thinking, yes, no, no gray areas. Um, life, they're still kind of in that life is not fair. They're kind of still in that window. And during this, and it's not obviously not to talk down to anybody, but obviously it's not like the minute you hit 25, bam, you're done, timer goes off, take it out of the oven, right? This is a range that we've identified through the research. So I want to talk about for a minute about neural pathways. So if you will, I want you to take your hands and hold them up in front of you like this. Now I want you to imagine that each fist represents a neuron. So a neuron is a neurochemical reaction that happens that sends a message to some part of our brain or body to make something happen. So the when I hear the oven timer go off, I go open the oven door. Now, every time that I cook, which is infrequent, uh, but every time that happens, it's like somebody pours super glue. And easy way to remember that is neurons that fire together wire together. So the more often, if I suddenly became a chef, which I don't see happening, but if I suddenly were to become a chef, every time I hear that little timer ding, I'm going to go to the oven. That's a pretty, innocuous example. That is why You may see a veteran who comes home and they hear a car backfire, fireworks, loud boom, right? That's that stimuli, loud boom, and that means hit the ground or start running, start fighting, whatever fear, whatever response they've had to have in the past to ensure their safety. Um, so then as those neurons start connecting, they form a pathway so that a series of things happens, right? The oven timer goes off. I go to the oven. I get out the thermometer to make sure whatever I'm cooking is at temperature. I get the oven mitts out so I don't burn myself. And I take it out, so on and so forth, right? Like a recipe. Um, you can also think of it like if you happen to live next door to your best friend, over the years you've worn a path through the woods. The more worn it gets, the faster you're going to travel along that path, right? Now let's imagine one day you encounter a snake or something else, some other unpleasant happening on that path. Now, if you're me, you're selling your house and you're now driving to your best friend's house. But for others of you, maybe it's something else that would be horribly scary. Um, but you're probably not going to stop going to their house, right? I mean, of course not. They're still your best friend. You might start to find a new pathway because the other one has something, either it's impassable because a tree's fallen down or you literally can't go that way anymore, or you're scared of something over there. So what happens is you find a new path, but you're going to go slowly all of those time, those first handful of times, right? Because you're looking for where to step and what's safe and um, where you're going and where you're putting your feet and all that. But over time, what's going to happen? It's going to get worn in, right? So now you're going to have a new worn in path. Um, so that's all of that to say that is what we are hoping to do with trauma therapy. We're hoping to break those neural networks that when a survivor, say, hears somebody, like say their perpetrator has a very distinctive accent or tone of voice or something, right? And the survivor is out there living their life and they hear somebody with the same sounding voice, their amygdala goes, wait a minute, last time I heard that voice, I was something horrible happened to me and I was in danger. And it starts the fight, flight, freeze sequence, right? Like they get triggered, activated. Um, because when something very emotional happens, our brain stores it, especially if it's related to danger or survival, it stores it for easy access, right? Um, but with trauma therapies, what we're doing is going in and we're trying to break, like we're pulling apart that's those superglued neurons, the ones that are saying, I hear this voice, I must run away and hide, even though if I were able, when the amygdala is triggered, it turns your brain off like a Wi-Fi router going down. And everything's dark except for that amygdala. And the amygdala is very useful and we need it for survival, but unfortunately, it is easily fooled and it likes to lie to us. So it will hear that voice and it will say, you're in danger, you need to run away and hide. And um, so what we want to do is break that connection, right? So the the developing neural circuits after trauma, hypervigilance, dissociation, and emotional dysregulation become wired in as a baseline system rather than temporary reactions, especially at this stage, because their brains are kind of like if you think about like Play-Doh, right? Like when you first take it out of the can, or if it's cold or whatever, and it's, you can barely, but like that point where you're just starting to be able to kind of mold it and move it, right? Because it started to warm up a little bit in your hands. That is the stage we're talking about. It's firm, but it's still got some malleability to it. It's still got what we call neuroplasticity, where we can change. We can still change things. That's not to say that we are going to make it so they never remember what happened to them, they never think about it, they never have any other struggles in their life. But like I said before, hopefully early therapeutic intervention doesn't just reduce symptoms, it prevents trauma responses from becoming permanent developmental patterns. So basically, in other words, therapy at this stage is not just treatment, it's neurological prevention. So I and I'm going to assume if you're here, you're at this workshop, that you know what IPV means, interpersonal violence. And if it's okay with everyone, I'm going to continue to refer to it as IPV. Um, just rolls off the tongue a little easier. So IPV experienced during early adulthood creates a neural network that creates a vicious cycle with the initiating event and sends a survivor around the cycle anytime something or someone activates the neural network that holds the initiating event. This is called being triggered, being activated. Triggered has become a very pop culture word. A lot of people are using it in mainstream now. My son will tell me he's triggered because I won't let him go to a friend's house. So it's become a little bit um, cliche, which is unfortunate because it's taken some of the power away for the people that truly do hold trauma. Um, but when this cycle is initiated, the survivor's brain is sending out fear and danger signals, telling them that the event is currently happening to them. So they are like actively reliving it instead of just, eh, that happened to me. It was horrible that that happened to me. Ideally, what's wonderful is when I take somebody through trauma therapy and we get to the end and I tell them during the first session and they never believe me. And they always look at me like I'm crazy. That by the end, we will have made meaning and that we will be doing an exercise called the gifts of trauma. And I'll get to that in this, but that's the hope. This is just a quick some of the symptoms that you may be seeing in this population. Disordered temper and lots of anxiety, social and academic withdrawal, um, academic decline, withdrawing, low help seeking behaviors. And sadly, a lot of people think that's lack of motivation on the survivor's part. It truly isn't. It is that their brain is not allowing them. Their brain is just not in that, it doesn't have that capability right now until either they deal with the trauma or if they decide to just say, nope, I've made my report, or that night happened, or whatever, I don't want to think about it anymore. I'm gonna put it away in the very back of the mental filing cabinet and never think about it again. That's when, they still have all these symptoms. If you've ever heard the term a dry drunk, very similar, very similar thought process. They still have the problem. They're just walking around acting like it's not there, but it is definitely still causing damage. When a human experiences something that generates a big emotion, that event is much more likely to be stored in the hippocampus, which is what I call the vault. It sits right back here, kind of where that bone is behind your right ear. At night, if you've ever watched, especially a baby, or if you've ever watched a person sleeping and their eyes are darting back and forth, that is called rapid eye movement. It's also called bilateral stimulation because it's stimulating each side of the brain. What that bilateral stimulation is doing is basically like taking a key to the vault and unlocking it and deciding, okay, this was, I was in this meeting today and my supervisor said this. That's important. I need to remember that or I'll lose my job. So I'm going to put that in this green folder over here. Um, I was driving down the road and somebody, ran a yellow that, turned red like the second they passed over the line, they almost hit me. I'm going to put that in the need to remember to be a proactive driver, watch for people who are like don't take off the minute the light turns green for me because somebody might, try to run the yellow, right? And end up hitting me. So I'm going to store that in the red folder. Um, the the problem is that, and I used a pretty innocuous example there, but problem is that then when that any stimuli that resembles anything that was happening during the event, during the traumatic event, when that happens, the amygdala thinks it's happening again and sends out adrenaline and cortisol, which affects, which gets into some of the physical effects on our body. Um, so the lasting impacts of early adulthood trauma, and really it's not just early adulthood trauma, but it seems to be worse if left untreated during early adulthood trauma. Increased vulnerability to future assault, higher rates of chronic illness and early death, weakened immune system, leading to increased illnesses and possibly invasive medical procedures, which can be re-traumatizing. That's something I'll actually cover right at the beginning of our question section. Somebody had submitted that question before the session, so I have an answer for you for that. Um, Increased risk of other mental illness or substance abuse disorders, and then impairment in other areas of life that lead to those increased traumatic events. So I want to share a case study or a case. Uh, we're going to call her D. When Dee first arrived at college, she was bright, bubbly, and extremely outgoing. A few months into her first semester, she began being sexually exploited by a much, much older man. Now, to add some context, this all happened in the early 90s when no one was doing bystander education, prevention, talking about sexual assault. There was no Me Too movement. It was just not something that was being talked about. Um, Soon, soon after the interaction stopped, many members of her small town became aware, and as you can probably guess, did not blame him, but rather engaged in vicious victim blaming for many years to follow. She began experiencing severe depression, anxiety, mood dysregulation, academic decline, and many of the other previously explained symptoms. She first sought out campus counseling, where she was referred to a psychiatrist off campus. This is where her story starts a tragic, lifelong path of further traumas and damage. This psychiatrist diagnosed her with bipolar 1, ADHD, major depressive disorder, and generalized anxiety disorder. Four mental health diagnoses laid on a previously happy, bubbly, no problems 19-year-old. Uh, with those diagnoses began a complicated regimen of medications, many of which we now know harmed her physically and neurologically, leaving her primed for future traumas. That psychiatrist was the first of a long line of mental health clinicians who would continue to add and or change both her diagnoses and the medications used to treat them. By her late 20s, she was taking 33 medications. 33. Because of course, this one has a side effect, so then you have to treat the side effect and so on and so forth, right? And it just snowballs. Um, this went on for over 20 years. She mainly only ever saw psychiatrists who I don't want to denigrate. They're valuable, they have their place, the good ones do good work. But they do tend to be medication first, right? They want to see things that they can medicate. So there's not a lot of talk therapy going on. Uh, she also started to have physical problems, and to such a degree that, but doctors always just chalked it up to the mental health issues. Oh, well, I see here in her chart she's bipolar. I see here in her chart she's got borderline personality disorder. She's making this up. She's drug seeking. Fill in the blank. And this happened to such a degree that she actually ended up losing a kidney to cancer because it was diagnosed so late. She amassed over $40,000 in dental bills due to medication side effects and eventually developed substance use disorder to both pharmaceutical pills and alcohol. She also married a violently abusive man, a fact she never shared with anyone because she didn't feel she would be believed or that she even deserved help. So there's that re-traumatization or secondary trauma, right? Like we know that survivors of interpersonal violence are more susceptible to repeat violence than someone who has never been a victim of violence before. Um, but she had been so gaslit by this point that she believed she was simply mentally ill, and that was the cause of all of her problems. Skipping ahead to her early 40s, she had moved back home to live with her parents, unable to care for herself in any meaningful way. At age 44, she was battling an alcohol addiction and for the first time entered a trauma-based residential program where she received trauma interventions such as EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And I'll explain that in a little bit further in just a second. Hang with me. Art therapy, equestrian therapy, and many other trauma interventions. Perhaps almost as important as the trauma therapy was that she was given autonomy, respect, validation, and a safe space to process the various traumas she had endured. She literally cried at one point and said, "They didn't take my shoelaces. They're letting me walk around and go to eat whenever I want, or go for a walk outside whenever I want. There's not an orderly following me around." It was life-changing. Upon her discharge, she stayed in a transitional housing and then was able to get her own apartment. She attended 12-step meetings regularly and had even begun to run meetings and prepare to sponsor others upon her 1 year anniversary. She said that she finally felt whole again, like the person she had been prior to the first sexual trauma. Sadly, Dee suffered a massive heart attack at age 45, 3 weeks shy of her 1 year sober date. Though by this time it was evident she had numerous health issues, cardiac issues were nowhere on the list. No one knew that was a problem. I felt it important to share this story with you to emphasize the importance of early trauma intervention. Dee's is a story of a perfect storm, being put on a mental health track that never engaged her trauma history, taken on and off dangerous psychiatric meds for decades, and the physical and neurological effects of trauma that came together to end her life just as she had begun to truly heal. This is a heartbreaking case that reflects system failure, not individual weakness. Um, since I can't see you all, I know that was a heavy story and told much more quickly than it should have been to do it justice. Um, if you, I mean, I won't know, but please do what you need to do to take care of yourself. If you need to take a moment of silence, if you need to step away for a minute, if this is triggering for you, please do what you need to do to take care of yourself. So this is that same wheel that was up again. Where it turns pink is where we've intervened. We've gotten them into trauma therapy, and you see things start to change from that first wheel. And I want to talk about the term somatic. This refers to real physical sensations like pain, fatigue, dizziness that are typically linked to psychological distress. They happen when the mind and body connection is disrupted, causing the body to overreact to stress. So, for a trauma victim who is living with a whole lot of hypervigilance and they're looking around every corner and they're waiting for the next thing to happen and their central nervous system is just up here. I talk about it with my clients as though they are just standing on the edge of the cliff and the slightest breeze is going to knock them over. And so our goal with trauma therapy is to get, everything we can do is like taking a step back from the cliff, right? So they've got a little bit of room when something happens. Um, as I said, everything is stored back here in our hippocampus. The problem with talk therapy alone, although it has its place and its value certainly, but the problem is our verbal skills are on the left side of our brain while our memories are stored on the right side of our brain. So we can talk about it all day long and twice on Sunday, but the problem with talk therapy alone is that it is never going to get into that vault and take it out or reprocess it. So that's what just one example of a trauma intervention that can help is, as I mentioned earlier, EMDR, and that's eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, which uses that bilateral stimulation, right? Like when you're watching somebody asleep, that the bilateral stimulation does two things. It initiates the parasympathetic nervous system to relax somebody as they relive, like memory wise, relive the trauma. It's relaxing. It's getting their parasympathetic nervous system and their central nervous system used to thinking about that trauma um, while staying calm. And then during that, we also can reprocess some aspects of the event. Um, and I apologize. I'm trying to balance between. I mean, I could go down the rabbit hole and explain all things neurobiological trauma to you. So, but I'm trying to stay sort of on the surface to give you an idea and then get into where this meets prevention. So I know I'm throwing a lot of stuff out. If you have questions about any of this later, even if you watch the video 2 months from now, or you want to know more about a subject, please feel free to reach out to me. And I'm always happy to share resources to learn a little bit more about this stuff. Um, so basically what we're trying to do is we're trying to break that reaction. Um, if you've ever been to like a real estate open house and realtor thinks they're clever and bakes cookies, right, for that homey feeling, that's all great and wonderful until, let's pretend, me as a child, my mother was making cookies and I was so excited that I opened up the oven and reached in and grabbed the pan at 400 degrees and, suffered whatever degree burn that would be. But suffered a horrible burn, very painful, and saw how upset my mother got at the ensuing kind of chaos that would happen around that, right? So when I walk into that open house, if I haven't done any work around that, and yes, this is a pretty simplified trauma, um, and maybe not something somebody would register as a trauma, but a memory nonetheless, right? Um, when I walk into that house, I may not immediately like smell it and run out the door, but I might just walk around the house like I don't know. I mean, there's just something not right. Like I like this house has everything I said I wanted. It has the porch, it has the this, it has the pool, it has the that, all the things, but I don't know. I can't live here. There's just just something I can't live here. And until I get outside, I may not start to feel normal again. Or, sorry, I try not to use the word normal. Um, but I may not feel like myself until we have driven away from the house and I have been able to regulate myself again. Because for me, walking into that house, what was it? Smelling the cookies, right? Smelling that smell. Maybe my hand even started to hurt, but certainly my body was was experiencing adrenaline and cortisol release that were telling me that I was in danger. So successful trauma therapy forms new neural pathways so that that doesn't happen. And um, we also are able to work through through the trauma. And in some cases, I mean, in most cases, we can find, I can help people find gifts of trauma. Now, I don't want that to sound like I'm being Pollyanna and saying, oh, we're going to be perfectly fine and happy that this happened to us. That's not at all what I mean. What I mean is, for instance, for me, one gift of my trauma as a survivor is that I went to school, became a therapist, and started working with trauma victims and started working with those who have substance use disorders. And that is very fulfilling work for me. And I have helped, I've helped a lot of people. So that's one of the ways that I have made meaning out of my trauma. Does it mean I wish it hadn't happened? Of course I wish it hadn't happened, but it did. And the fact that I can't unmake it happen, I'm gonna make some meaning out of it. I'm gonna realize what skill I learned or what other situation was created out of this. Now, if you can do this with an 18-year-old and they're able to look at that and reframe and reshape things at that age, they are going to be less likely to marry the abusive man. They're going to be less likely to suffer weakened immune system and medical interventions, they are going to be very much more like less likely to encounter a life like Dee had. So that is why this topic is so important to me. Um, I know that I have folks in here of all roles and types of work and involvement in this movement. Um, but if you have been working with victims, you probably know a lot of this. Um, but I just wanted to highlight we're emphasizing safety, learning a few basic grounding skills you can use when a victim first discloses or seems to be triggered during a later discussion of the event. As you know, especially on college, I was a campus victims advocate, and it was pain, and I was a hospital responder for a uh, local domestic violence and sexual assault agency in my area, um, in where I live. And it was painful to watch, even in one night, a rape survivor a rape victim would come in and have to tell their story to the nurse. And then potentially police officers get there and they have to tell their story immediately again. And then the next day, the police want to see them and want to hear their story. And then, yeah, I mean, you all have probably seen if you work directly with victims that they have to tell their story multiple times. Um, so the therapeutic response principles is about emphasizing immediate safety. You are safe now. It's not just saying those words, but it's about learning grounding skills to help them realize. Um, and I will put in the handouts section and resources section of Hoover, a quick handout with some go-to very popular grounding and recentering um, exercises that are vary in length and ease of doing them. Some of them, you can teach your survivors that you're working with um, to do for themselves or to teach others to help them do. But where I want to start shifting this into, how my world intersects with the campus world at this point, um, I want I want to brainstorm. I want to think of ideas, put some ideas out there um, about how we set up continuity of care with therapeutic partners. One way is using the warm handoff when transferring a survivor to anybody else who's going to be involved with them, whether that's somebody on campus, if it's a therapist that know, doing some, maybe going so far as to set up a short, like 5 minute telehealth call to introduce them. If they've built trust in you and then, you say, I know and trust this person, this therapist, idea being that that transfers to them, right? Um, now, it's great to have a victim who's ready to receive therapy. Unfortunately, it's not always as easy as getting their buy-in. Some of the barriers we are in the worst mental health crisis ever documented. Um, and it is certainly, as I'm sure many of you know, I'm sure I have some folks here from campus counseling centers, that is hitting college campuses extremely hard. Um, there are there's a high demand for mental health services, high turnover in providers and clinicians. Some universities and colleges have limits of 6 to 12. My daughter is at a major university, and she has a limit of six per year. She went her freshman year. to find out, and that she was told that she would have access to 6 sessions a year. Um, and then they would have to refer her out, which, is very hard to tell somebody, well, I can see you for 6 sessions, and then I'm gonna have to refer you out to somebody else. How much trust are you really going to build in that person, right? Knowing you're going to have to move on soon. Then, of course, there's financial aspects of paying for therapy, transportation to off-campus services, um, the low help-seeking behaviors we see in those that have just experienced trauma, stigma and fear of repercussions to disclosing drug and alcohol involvement in the assault. Um, those are just some. So, prevention and therapeutic partnerships. Prevention efforts are, more the bystander education, consent education, advocacy. Therapeutic is access to campus counseling, telehealth options, community partnerships with providers. These are just a few. I want to take, oh, actually, I'm doing better than I thought I was. So let's maybe take 2 or 3 minutes if you guys are willing. Um, and somebody may have to help me with this, but if you have an idea, if you want to put it in the chat, we can moderate through the chat, or I think if you raise your digital hand, we can unmute you. But I'd like to spend like 2 or 3 minutes and maybe just throw out some ideas for how we create a network on campus and, blending campus and community resources, to try to get therapy for the survivors who are willing to engage in therapy, some ways that we can help them deal with the barriers.
Melissa, I'm happy to read out if anyone puts stuff in the chat if you would like
Okay,
me.
thanks. Yeah, I was trying to look at my phone too. And I can't see, I've got the grid view up, but I don't think I can see everybody. So I don't know if I'm missing anybody that maybe has a hand up. Um, okay. Well, to prompt you guys a little bit, some of the ideas that I did not put on here, are peer support training. Some of you may already be doing that, have peer support networks, or, peer support pieces to what you're doing on your campuses. Um, but what I'm talking about is maybe expanding peer support training to, um, having ride share opportunity, peers that are cleared or whatever. I'm not a lawyer. I don't know how to get into all that stuff. That would be somebody else to talk to on your campus. But, if ride share opportunities, um, basically don't be willing to make the ask. Reach out to, I believe I've heard that Lyft and Uber actually have some accommodations um, for those who need medical care, or for assault victims to get somewhere safe. Um, but reaching out to organizations, companies in your area, therapists, a lot of therapists after COVID gave up their offices and are doing mostly telehealth, and they might be willing to come in and do a trauma, they might be willing to do a trauma session, but they no longer have an office, or their one office day is filled up. Um, One idea that I had was, asking, the powers that be on your campus, for spaces to be offered that community therapists might be able to come in and provide low or no cost sessions, um, or even group therapy. Group therapy is a wonderful low cost way to access therapy and to also build community amongst survivors. Um, so And just like in a classroom or if you've ever been in something like that, anything that resembles group therapy, I can tell you that the members that are in of a group therapy group tend to take what the person sitting to their right says and give it much more credibility than the person who is facilitating, who if they know nothing about, assume learned this in a class or read a book or went through a certification training, right? Like they don't see them as the same. The person sitting to their right or to their left, they see as having a similar lived experience to what they have, and that can do wonders. But if you, let's say you have a therapist who charges $100 an hour, if she's going to do an hour group, if she does an hour group session and she charges each participant $20, well, she's just spent an hour and she's made that same $100, right? But she's seen 5 clients, and there are also a lot of other interventions that are really well done in groups that are better in groups than in individual sessions. So it has that combined benefit.
Melissa, we do have some things in the chat if you'd like me
Oh,
to read them
okay.
aloud.
Well, yes, that'd be
Um,
awesome. Thank you.
Louise shared campus staff attending community task force meetings to establish relationships.
Hmm.
Jessica shared this isn't specific for therapy, but for coordinating trauma-informed collaborative care. I do trainings for our health center regarding how trauma impacts help seeking for medical concerns, especially for young women starting to get PAPS or students seeking STI testing. Um, Kitty shared maybe campuses that don't have their own counselors but contract with local mental health agencies to have on-campus days. So something you kind of mentioned. And then Jessica also shared, I've also discussed doing trauma-informed trainings for our campus police department and campus emergency
Yes.
services. We haven't gotten it off the ground, but our department has been very receptive in building more skills to be trauma-informed in general, not just related to IPV.
Yes. The last one, law enforcement, um I don't want to click back through the slides, but the victim-centered interviewing, that is huge. And if you can engage, whether it's your campus um security branch, or your local police department. I know different places it works different ways, whether or not it is kept solely on campus with campus police, or whether, um, for instance, Raleigh Police Department versus it being kept just on with NC State's police force. Um, there is a program, if you're not familiar with it, called SALT, Sexual Assault Response Team. And it's a nationwide movement, but what that is it's like we had one here in Wake County. I assume it's still running. But those meetings would consist of representatives from the Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault Advocacy Center, um, representatives from we have several major universities and colleges in this area. So, a lot of times the schools would send someone to the meetings. We would have law enforcement officers there. We would have victims advocates from schools there. We would sometimes even have medical professionals come in. Different topic was discussed at each meeting, trends, things they're seeing, like an uptick in drug facilitated assaults, things like that. But the biggest thing is helping helping law enforcement or whatever judicial process happens after an assault, anyone who is involved in that, getting them to understand trauma. I think honestly, what if I was independently wealthy and could wave my little magic wand and make the world the way I want it to be, I would say that every person who deals with a a victim has to go through a trauma class to understand the effects of trauma on the brain. Very quickly, the best example I ever heard was, and this was relayed by somebody who had gone to another training. But she said that the trainer came in and gave the example of, I'm gonna hand you this stack of sticky notes, and I want you to write down every single solitary thing that I say during this presentation. Now, and then at the end of the presentation, I'm going to take it back from you and I'm going to take it back to my office and I'm going to take it all apart and I'm going to crumple some of them up and I'm going to mess them all up on my messy desk under stuff. And then I'm going to invite you to come to my office in about 30 days, 6 week, 6 to 8 weeks, whatever. Um, and tell you that the only way that I'm going to believe that you attended my training was if you can find all of the sticky notes and put them back perfectly flattened out, no wrinkles, put them back in order, in the correct order of that the presentation was given. That's the only way I'm going to believe that you attended my training and give you your CE credits for it. That's essentially what we're asking trauma victims to do when they are initially interviewed, especially if it is the day, they immediately go to the emergency room or they immediately disclose and they immediately undergo an interview by law enforcement or by a campus judicial presence, whatever that may be in your area. That's what we're asking people to do because trauma does not store memories in a linear fashion. it it kind of hobgobbles it all over the place trying to make sense of it because when you've come out of the danger, your prefrontal cortex, which is logic, judgment, decision making skills, reasoning, has come back online and is now trying to make sense of what has happened to you. And because there is no logic to be made out of being sexually assaulted, for example, the brain is just struggling to do that. So it is not going to remember things in order necessarily. And I've seen far too many. I used to, when I was a hospital responder, I used to joke to my husband that we needed to start a bail fund because one of these nights I was going to be arrested sitting through a police interview where they accused her of walked out saying they didn't believe her because she couldn't remember this. Well, how could she not remember where she was? How could she not remember who she was with? How could she not remember what color his shirt was? On and on and on. Um, and so yes, yes, yes. So much agreement to that last one, but all the other ideas are wonderful. I really encourage you guys to take this back to your campuses and in whatever campus meetings you're having. Do the same thing. Just have a brainstorming session. Get out. If I didn't have my thing blurred, my little, big sheet of paper thing. I'm still analog. I still like my big poster sheets to brainstorm on. Um, but get together, get your groups together, involve students, involve therapists, involve campus and community stakeholders, and just brainstorm. Just throw things out there. I mean, don't be afraid to don't be afraid to make the ask, so to speak. Sorry, my computer froze up for a second there. Um, so really quickly. And finding a therapist is not always easy because we've experienced a lot of loss of therapists in the industry, just burnout, especially after COVID. Um, Also, insurance reimbursements are being cut in half, so a lot of therapists are going out of network, which is meaning even more of an increased barrier, especially to this age group, to this population that does not have, does if they either do not have insurance or they do not have the ability to pay a provider. um, that's making it even harder on them. But if you do get buy-in that they want to see a therapist, and sorry, I should have put check with Campus Counseling Center first on the list, but because they may have a referral list, and I strongly encourage campus counseling centers to have referral lists for local therapists. A lot of therapists hold one or two spots on their caseloads for low or no cost sessions. It's just something that we do ethically, kind of like lawyers do pro bono. Therapists do the same thing. So I encourage campus counseling centers to have lists of those therapists on hand. Um, Invite those therapists to campus events at, like your women's center or your student center or wherever that may be for you. But if they are insured, the first thing to do is call the customer service number on the back to find out what their benefits are, both in and out of network, what the reimbursement rates are for out of network providers, um, session limits. And then you can check the insurance carrier's website for a provider directory. The reason I said about reimbursement rates for out of network providers is that like I'm an out of network provider, but I have a client who I don't know, she has the best insurance I've ever heard of in my life, and I have no idea what she did to get it, but she was getting 70% back. So, I can't do math right this minute off what my self-pay rate is, but let's just pretend it's $100. If it was $100, and she's now only paying $30 for therapy. And um, engaging college kids in this, to them that may still seem like a lot, but you know, this is where I brainstormed a little with my own college student in my house who said, you put it to them like that's that's a case of beer, or that's one less Starbucks a week every month. Like put it in terms of, oh well, I just have to, skip one Starbucks a week, or not go to Chick-fil-A four times a week, or what, like I just, they're very like put it into the tangible terms um, of what they're already paying for, that they do have the money. They just need to prioritize this. And this is not forever. Intensive trauma therapy, like I'm talking about, is not forever. For most people, especially if it is done right after the incident, if it's quickly after the incident, it can be as short as 2 to 3 months of intensive therapy, especially if it's single incident trauma, which that's the goal here, is to catch these 18 to 25-year olds while it is still single incident trauma versus when they're 35 or 40 and they now have had multiple medical interventions and they've been suffering with depression and they've lost jobs and they can't keep a relationship and right. So that's the goal. Um, the biggest things, I hope that I have communicated is getting creative with solutions. Unfortunately, that's the world we live in today, is we have to get creative with how to fund things, how to get access to things for our students. Well, for anyone who needs assistance, but especially this population. Um, Working on those campus and community partnerships, peer-led engagements, making the ask. If you are here, if you are at this conference, it tells me that you are at least on some level committed to this fight to end interpersonal violence, to help those who have been through it. Um, I have to think you're not afraid to make the hard ask. Always leading with trauma-informed victim responses and um, surprise, surprise, I was a little over where I wanted to be. So I'm not going to tell this. I'm not going to tell the story, but I am going to emphasize trauma is not a mental illness. It is a mental injury. And the reason why I make that point is when you think of illness, you think chronic, um, rest of your life disease, right? Like you think cancer or diabetes or whatever. Um, Whereas injury, right? You think of injury connotates more of a like broken leg, broken arm, something that can be healed. And interpersonal violence trauma, it can be healed. Now, can't be done away with completely, but it can be gotten to a place in a person's brain where they are able to take back their life and be happy. Um, and very quickly, shoot, sorry, I knew I'd be over. I do want to tell very quickly because this question came in really early, and it also, to be honest, this is actually it hit a nerve with me, but this is also something very important. The risk of re-traumatization for survivors needing invasive medical care. So I will tell this very quickly. Both of my children were emergency C-section deliveries, which meant immediate, sudden loss of bodily autonomy for me. They ran me down the hall, literally, as you see in this one picture, strapped me to the OR table as a survivor. You can imagine. After my children were born, my husband was able to like kind of lean over and I could kiss each one of them on the forehead, and then he was ushered out of the room, which affect years later it can I didn't know back then. I didn't know anything about trauma. I had not been to graduate school. I was a communications undergraduate. I mean, I was a major. I was an undergraduate who had graduated with a communications degree. Um, but I developed postpartum depression, which triggers emotions of invalidation very similar to what survivors experience right after their assault. Um, when it's postpartum depression, somebody may say something like, "Oh, how happy you should be with a healthy baby." That feels a lot like you should be happy they didn't do something worse during the assault. Um, right, those insensitive things that we hear people say. But clinically, what we see is that unresolved trauma can make medical procedures, especially childbirth, for sexual assault survivors, um, or sexual violence, deeply destabilizing for survivors, which is why teaching trauma-informed medical advocacy to both survivors and medical providers, just like us, I'm not law enforcement, medical doctors need to go through neurobiology of trauma and understand trauma-informed care. Um, but this is vitally important for all trauma survivors, not just pregnant women, because invasive medical procedures oftentimes means loss of autonomy, loss of your voice, right? Feeling out of control. Um, so I'm going to shut up. We have about 6 minutes if my timer's right. Am I right?
Oh, we have
Ish.
4 minutes left.
Oh, 4 minutes. Okay. Does anybody have a burning question? Okay. Um, Feel free to interrupt me if one comes to you. I know we only have 4 minutes. I apologize about that. But I do truly want to take a minute as we close to thank each and every one of you for whatever your role is and whatever has brought you here. Not only because I was one of you. I've worked in, like I said, various roles, both on campus and in the community, and I know how hard and gut-wrenching and heartbreak just how hard it can be, but also how rewarding it can be. But I want to thank you all for what you're doing. I'm also the mother of a cisgendered female in college right now. And then I have a cisgendered son who will be entering, she graduates 1 year, she graduates May of 27. He steps in to college August of 27. So I have 4.5 years left, 4 or 5.5 years left. Of worrying about this issue, but knowing that folks like you are out there protecting not only my children, but others' children, others' people in the world. Yeah, I just thank you so much. Thank you for picking my session. I hope that you got something out of it, and I truly wish you all a wonderful end of the year. I hope if you work on college campuses, this means you get the same campus breaks. I know it's different places, but enjoy your winter activities, holidays, breaks, the new year, and thank you so much again for attending the conference and attending my session. Um, as you know, we all have access to the stuff for 3 months, so you will have access to my information. By all means, please reach out to me if I can ever help with anything.
Thanks, Melissa.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your help. I appreciate it. I could not have done it without you. Um, so I think, yeah, I guess we're like right at time now because I think I was 2 minutes behind you. So